The city has been standing on the western banks of the Volga River for over 3.5 centuries and is no stranger to bloodshed. During the Russian Civil War, its population battled for survival against the murderous Cossacks of the Don host and in the mighty White Army itself. Such loyalty and determination have now been recognised, with the illustrious honour of adopting the same name as the country's mighty leader. It appears, though, that this fine accolade has instead been hiding a terrible curse, ultimately tying the fate of the residents to that of Joseph Stalin himself. Consumed by feelings of jealousy and loathing, Germany's leader has made it his goal to scour the city that bears his opponent's name from the face of the earth. The Führer's armies and air force have used all of their might to fulfill this demand, leaving little standing save for a broken skeleton of twisted metal and crumbling concrete. And yet, much like any other recently created corpse, these decaying remains now teem with microscopic activity. Amidst the shattered streets and collapsing alleyways, isolated pockets of defenders fight desperate hand-to-hand battles against the massed German invaders. But now, after 3 long and bloody months of battle, it seems their resistance may finally be at an end. From his observation point on the eastern bank, Captain Grigory Ivankov watches on in despair as the German ordnance rains down upon the city's smouldering remnants. The skies are so thick with black and acrid smoke that he can no longer see the aircraft that are dropping these bombs, their presence instead marked only by the fiery explosions that are created as they incessantly carpet the ground below. Lowering his binoculars, Vankov turns his attention back to the chart pinned to the wall nearby. As is customary, it has been updated that morning with reports from those survivors deemed sufficiently wounded to be shipped back across the river for medical treatment. The German forces now hold over 90% of the city's remains and are visibly massing for one final push down to the docks. Suddenly overpowered by a sense of utter hopelessness, the young Soviet officer begins to weep uncontrollably. Several months before, he had been briefed on the contingency plans for this situation, should the defence of the city deteriorate to this point. In truth, he knows the events he must now set in motion will prove even more horrific than what has already taken place, but there is no other way. Hands trembling, he reaches for the field telephone on his desk and prepares to offer his report. When Vankov's summary of the situation is received at divisional headquarters, a few minutes later, he is curtly asked if he understands what it is he is reporting. Once this has been clarified, the information in turn is then passed on to the general himself. Unlike his subordinate, Georgy Zhukov has neither fear nor misgiving about the orders he will now give. Pouring himself a drink, he dispatches his adjutant to make the necessary arrangements before sinking back into his chair. The end of the battle for Stalingrad is indeed now in sight. The barges that unexpectedly materialised in the staging area one morning, having been delivered under the cover of darkness. There are 4 in total, all constructed with solid timber walls that prevent anybody from seeing what is stored inside. They have remained under constant guard by a detachment of NKVD troops, easily identifiable by the infamous dark blue caps they wear atop their heads. So far, not one of the workers has been brave enough to approach the transports, but several claim to have heard the sounds of moaning emanating from inside. Some speculate they are filled with German prisoners of war. Others believe this is where the recaptured deserters of their own army have been left to starve to death. Now, as the battle for Stalingrad approaches its conclusion, the guards assigned to protect the barges begin to bark out orders, preparing for them to be towed across the waters to the city. Each of the floating containers is secured to a boat, before the guards then scramble on top, ready to defend them from aerial attack. Mercifully, the thick smoke that blankets the ruins is now beginning to drift slowly across the river towards them, hiding the vessels from the German pilots. The point where the crossing is undertaken is only 1 mile in diameter. Such trips, though, are never executed with any speed, due to the poor quality of the few remaining tugboats. Russian soldiers joke the bed of the Volga here is so covered in sunken craft they can walk from one side to the other without getting wet, although nobody has yet been brave enough to attempt this feat. As soon as they've pulled clear of the jetty, the tugboats disappear into what seems to be a wall of impenetrable haze, which has drifted across from the broken city. The barges themselves quickly follow suit, the visibility around them being reduced to nothing. For the next few minutes, the guards sit atop their transport in silence, listening to the faint sounds of the boats pulling them along. The journey seems to last for an eternity, the soldiers riding the transports holding tightly onto their weapons, keenly scanning the murkiness that has surrounded them for any sign of movement. Each of them knows the risk they are being ordered to take, and what will happen if they are unsuccessful in the delivery of their cargo. Few men have ever been entrusted with such great and unwanted responsibility. By now, the remaining territory held by the defenders on the west bank of the river has been reduced to a few narrow strips of ground. The infantrymen there are angered and confused by the orders to fall back, seemingly gifting the city that so many of their comrades have died for to the Nazi invaders. But they're also too terrified to question the orders of their famous general and risk the consequences that such open defiance would cause. They watch on, as familiar vessels loom out of the unnatural murk, each towing something they have never seen before. As the 4 barges make contact with the riverbank, officers and NCOs scream and yell at them to fall back, out of sight of the barges. When the last of the Russian soldiers has been cleared from the dock, the locks securing the front of each barge are smashed, the wooden walls falling down onto the ground. Slowly, figures emerge from the interior of each transport, shuffling forwards in an awkward and unnatural fashion. Gradually, their numbers increase, the mysterious passengers banding together into small groups and columns. Then they begin to move off, away from the docks, into the interior of the city, drawn to the sounds of nearby gunfire and artillery. When the last of their number has gone, the soldiers are ordered from their hiding places under strict instructions to remain completely silent. They listen on, bemused, as hushed orders are issued to break up the barges and use the wood to erect wooden barricades. This work is to be completed in silence, avoiding noise wherever possible. In addition to this, sentries are posted with orders to bayonet anyone approaching the docks, under no circumstances to fire their weapons. As the soldiers begin to silently prise apart the wooden timbers, they find themselves glancing nervously across at one another. These men have no idea what they've just witnessed, but the arrival of the newcomers seems to have brought with it a feeling of general unease. Several streets away from where the barges have made landfall, a platoon of German soldiers are also engaged in the process of erecting barricades of their own. The pioneers who have advanced forward into this sector are unsure why the Russians who are defending it have melted away so quickly. But they've been in this place long enough to realise this likely means they'll have little time before the inevitable counterattack begins. The young combat engineers go about their business with speed, repositioning the wreckage and debris, setting tripwires for the explosives they've secreted into the piles of rubble. There's a sudden cry from the flank of their position as one of the youths working there spies a group of Russian soldiers spilling forth from the alleyways ahead of their position. The approaching combatants are immediately scythed down by a lethal hail of heavy machine gun fire as the pioneers scramble down behind the safety of their barricade. There follows a short pause as the MG-42, positioned atop the nearby half-track, falls silent, the soldiers below it waiting confirmation the approaching threat has now been ended. But on rising to resume their work, there's a further cry of alarm, several of the downed Russians being seen to slowly rise up to their feet again. Reflexively, the young specialists dive once more for cover, whilst their guardian angel above resumes his deadly business, waiting for the weapon's deadly chorus to once again come to a conclusion, signifying the threat has been eliminated. Seconds pass. The murderous hail of fire taking place above them does not cease. Instead, it's joined by the insistent chatter of small caliber weapons belonging to the rest of the half-track's crew. The men crouching behind the barricades look nervously across to one another, questioning the intensity of the attack they are now facing. All at once, the deafening gunfire ceases, the machine gunner apparently having run out of ammunition. But as the lighter weapons continue to rattle away, a blood-soaked arm suddenly snakes down from the leading edge of the barricade, directly amongst their number. For the few moments it remains in sight, its appearance immediately causes panic amongst those observing it. Huge chunks of flesh are missing, the gristle and bone that lie beneath fully exposed to the elements. There's a shrill scream from a young soldier it takes hold of, before he is quickly drawn back, up over the rubble pile, his legs kicking away desperately. Seconds later, something that barely resembles a human drops down amongst the horrified troopers, the khaki uniform it once wore utterly tattered and shredded. Almost immediately, it lunges at the nearest engineer, falling atop the hapless German, before biting down hard into the meat of the soldier's exposed neck. Chaos takes hold, the engineers abandoning their tools, their weapons, rising to flee the trench they'd sought safety in, but it is already too late. A swarm of battered and bleeding bodies surge down into their refuge, dragging them to the ground, falling upon them, feasting. As the gunners atop the half-track abandon their weapons and run, the last thing they see is the group of figures behind them, now rising unsteadily back to their feet, the reanimated bodies of their dead comrades, visible amongst their growing number. Having concluded their grisly business with the first group of German soldiers they encountered, the mob pauses for a second, uncertain of its purpose. Nothing remains alive in their immediate vicinity, those who had once been, now having been incorporated amongst their own number. Livid, red blood stains spread out across not just their own tunics, but also those of their victims, uniting them in death. Although capable of movement, and the ability to end the lives of others, no conscious thought remains amongst what these men have now become. Merely the desire to seek out life, feast upon it, burdened by a hunger that can only temporarily be sated through consumption. They are dimly aware in the act of killing, their victims will join their number. But such a fact remains inconsequential to them on an individual level. No hierarchy exists amongst them, no ability or mechanism for one of their number to step up, to lead. They're simply drawn towards the living, or any trace of it, with the intention of ending those lives, and in doing so to stave off the gnawing hunger that has now consumed them. Of their past lives there remains no memory, no ability to distinguish between the differing languages or the uniforms of those they encounter. The undead possess no form of morality, the age and gender of their prey of little importance. And so they stand, their uncomprehending eyes moving back and forth across their number, taking in their newer and older members, waiting for something unexpected to stimulate them. Off to the west there is a distant sound, a persistent and noisy metallic chatter, an indication that something there remains alive. With a dull and hungry groan, several of the dead turn and begin to shamble forwards in the direction the sound came from, their actions slowly mirrored by those behind, the tragic throng of what had once been fighting men, shuffling onwards towards their prey. As this shambling column of the undead picks its way through the shattered cityscape, it gradually starts to part and separate. Individual entities become trapped or entangled on the debris they are making their way through, lacking the understanding to move or to avoid it. Here and there, lone figures wander off, away from the rabble, staggering down alleyways or side streets in search of the sounds they'd heard. Inevitably, these individuals emerge, encountering enemy positions or patrols, and are quickly destroyed in a lethal volley of gunfire. Painful experience having taught the occupiers not to hesitate through fear or mercy, having lost countless friends or comrades to the militiamen who were playing at dead or wounded. It will not be until a concentrated group of the creatures blunder into a street that has been rigged with landmines by the Germans that they next enjoy success. The patrol that creeps forward to inspect the bodies, blown clear of the wasteland, easily overwhelmed and consumed by the waiting dead. numbers swollen, and with the sounds of battle intensifying around them as more and more of their number encounter the Germans, they move on through the city. A group of field policemen who ventured forward in search of layabouts or miscreants suddenly find themselves that are being hunted. Their reanimated corpses go on to form part of a group that surprise a colonel and his adjutant, whose boredom had led them directly into the path of the growing horde. The hours wear on, the ranks of the undead gradually swelling with new additions, the size of the individual groups they divided into also increasing. All around the city, weary and fatigued pockets of German infantrymen find themselves overrun by the dead, or falling back in blind confusion and terror. Bizarre tales circulate of an unstoppable army of Russian cannibals, utterly overwhelming their positions, and as the groups of terrified and broken soldiers fall back, they are quickly halted and turned by their officers, assured that if their attackers have resorted to such barbarism, then victory must surely now be close. The initial days of the battle for the city have taught the Germans the limitations of armoured warfare within this twisted and broken environment. Losses to their tank companies have been crippling as Russians emerge from every cellar and every alleyway, utilising increasingly desperate and suicidal methods to incapacitate the vehicles their enemy so badly relies upon for victory. More and more, Lucas Kohler and his fellow tankers have found less need to employ the main weapon of their vehicle. Their machines instead deployed as a battering ram to clear the way for the grenadiers to penetrate the surrounding debris, or as a mobile fortress whose thick armour and heavy machine gun provides a rally point or cover for their fellows. Even deploying their resources as sparingly as this, the unit has continued to take losses, with Kohler's machine now being one of only 3 serviceable vehicles that remain. Now, as the end of the battle seems in sight, their trio of Mark IV Panzers have been pushed forward as part of a wider gamble, utilised to level several abandoned vehicles in order to form a mechanised redoubt amongst the rubble that remains, a fallback position for their men in the event of any Russian counter-offensive. Hours pass as the company's escorting grenadiers disappear off into the ruins, assisting with the final push to rid the city of its defenders. Finally, as the tedium becomes unbearable, their commander allows his men to take breaks outside the vehicles, to stretch their legs, to relieve themselves for a short period of time. It's during Kohler's allocated period that several grenadiers unexpectedly come running back towards the tanks. Barely has he drawn his weapon than the group continues off past him, disappearing at breakneck speed towards the rear of their lines. Clambering back towards the open hatch of his vehicle, Kohler suddenly catches sight of a huge mass of Russian troops shambling towards the 3 tanks. Their bodies plastered in a cloying mixture of dark red blood and lighter brick dust, eyes sightless, staring directly past the tanks, following the fleeing soldiers, mouths open and hungry. The young tanker stares on, paralysed with fear, as the machine guns on the 3 machines now open up, slashing directly into the approaching mob. Countless figures seem to dissolve beneath the hailstorm of death that's been unleashed upon them, but still they come, their pace only seeming to increase. Deafening explosions suddenly sound out around the soldier, the violent recoil of his own vehicle's gun turret sending him stumbling backwards onto the debris-strewn street below. The last thing to pass before Kohler's eyes, as the approaching figures descend on him, is several of their number hauling themselves up onto his vehicle, dropping down and in through the hatch he had left open, in order to consume the comrades he has left exposed and helpless inside. Almost immediately, the tanks parked either side of their doomed sister revved their engines in an attempt to withdraw. But in their panic, the drivers of both trap their vehicles in the debris and are immediately surrounded by a seething mass of the undead. For the next 3 days, the dead remain there, clawing, scratching away at the hulls of the 2 trapped machines, their ceaseless moaning continuing day and night until a series of gunshots sound out from the interior of these vehicles, announcing the passing of those who had been trapped inside. Private Schulten Klein heralded from the rural town of Marburg, where they both learned to hunt and shoot at a young age. The childhood friends enlisted in the Führer's army together, their natural aptitude with a rifle leading them to become their company's sniper section. During many prior engagements, the pair have made it their business to locate to an elevated position from which to protect their comrades. Their individual actions have often tipped the battle in favour of their side, neutralising key elements of their opposition. Earlier that morning, the pair made their way back to their favourite spot near the front lines, a ruined apartment block that has somehow survived the devastation. In reality, it is by now little more than a decaying shell, with barely one usable staircase, which snakes up to the remnants of a flat rooftop. But it's from here they've spent the last few weeks engaged in a battle of wits with their Russian counterparts, taking cover between the artillery barrages before re-emerging to scan the ground around the German positions. But the two men are now consumed with sorrow as the rising tide of the undead spreads out from within the city's dock area. They are forced to watch on as increasing numbers of isolated and terrified infantrymen are stalked before being overwhelmed by the growing horde of the undead. And it's not long before whole units are falling prey to an unholy host of death that relentlessly sweeps all before them. Through their scopes, they witness uniform and flesh being torn and rendered from the bodies of their fellow Lancers, before those same victims then rise unsteadily to their feet, falling in step alongside those that ended their lives only minutes before. They observe how these monsters repeatedly rise from injuries inflicted to their bodies, only halted by damage caused directly to their skulls. And as the city fills up with the dead, the two attempt to flee their vantage point, only to now find the surrounding streets already overrun by the enemy. Returning to the roof, they spend the next few hours doing what they can to help, using their skills to assist individual soldiers in escaping the oncoming horde, placing bullets directly between the dead eyes of the oncoming horrors, those that wear both German uniforms and Russian. They continue to fire, slowly, methodically, as the first creature below is distracted by the sounds that now come from above it, before it turns and begins to mount the building staircase. The bayonet they have used to secure the door leading up to the roof survives the first few attempts to gain access, before finally breaking under a more sustained assault by the dead. Despite planning to save their last two bullets for themselves, the pair's persistent rifle fire masks the approach of the undead mob that forces its way out of the stairwell from behind them, only turning at the last moment before being swept to their deaths down into the streets below on a wave of hunger and savagery. Seated in the freezing cellar of what had once been a grand hotel prior to the arrival of the German forces, General Friedrich Paulus hangs his head in despair. For 3 months, he and his men have met everything the Russian defenders were able to muster, however senseless or desperate. But now, with victory in their grasp, the tide has turned. His forces slowly forced back through the centre of the shattered city by an apparently unstoppable enemy. Only when his men have been able to focus their heaviest weaponry along narrow alleyways and choke points have they been able to halt the dead. But even then, one careless action or a sudden shortage of ammunition has gone on to result in desperate retreat, only swelling the ranks of their opposition. And at the same time as this unexpected attack by a horrific new weapon, the Russian army has also surged around the flanks of the shattered city, making any attempt to disengage or to retreat an impossibility, meaning the only option for he and his men to survive would be to beg his Russian counterpart for mercy. Acknowledging the arrival of his adjutant, he reaches for the message the man holds, the reply from Berlin to his request to end this madness. Shaking his head in despair, he crumples up the paper, throwing it into the nearby fire, tears forming in his eyes. His request is refused. Instead, he is promoted to the rank of Field Marshal, because no Field Marshal of the Führer has ever surrendered an army to his enemies. The next few hours are amongst the longest of the general's life, as he drafts his reply and orders for it to be sent. Then with heavy heart he gives orders that contact be established with the Russian forces which have encircled his army. When Zhukov hears of the German request, he shows little emotion. This conclusion was inevitable. If anything, he is angered it has taken so long to reach this point. Pouring himself another drink, he gives orders for the torrid affair to finally be ended, so the next stage of the Russian fightback can begin. The soldiers manning the barricades down by the docks are tired and cold, but too afraid to close their eyes for any meaningful length of time. For days now, they have crouched by the waterside, listening on as the gunfire in the city dies away to the west, as the deafening artillery and ceaseless machine gun fire is replaced by the screams of the dying, screams so often cut short before they should have ended. Every so often, a shambling horror has found its way by accident back to its embarkation point, at which time it has been finished off with a shovel or a bayonet. Thus far, they have taken no casualties, but the fear the undead may discover them in larger numbers is ever present. Out of nowhere, the tugboats materialise once again behind them, towing barges full of soldiers dressed in white Arctic uniforms. As these reinforcements disembark, making their way into the city, there is only silence from the watching defenders. There is no mistaking the origins of their saviours, Siberians, easily identifiable by the heavy, double-edged Kandra blades that hang from their belts. It takes 2 days for the Siberians to achieve their goal, and they take casualties in the progress, but far less than the dead. Leading their enemies into dead ends, and choking fields of rubble and debris, they use their rifles and knives to deadly effect, only striking at the heads and faces of their opponents, making each and every attack count before moving swiftly on. From their frontline positions, what remains of the German 6th Army watch on, in a mixture of awe and wonder, as the massed ranks of the dead begin to drift back into the city. Several days later, a deputation of soldiers emerge, living Russian soldiers, requesting to speak with General Paulus. Within 24 hours, the 90,000 German soldiers that have survived the slaughter march into captivity. Zhukov's army does not remain to witness the humiliation, instead moving on to engage German forces on the Kalinin front. Stalingrad itself will remain under guard for the next few months, until such time it's decided that every trace of the undead has been destroyed or recovered. All that is, bar those required, should Russia once more find herself threatened by the spectre of defeat.